But Joe Polito has a postgraduate degree majoring in economics, finance, and human resources. And in 40 years of teaching secondary school, one of his subjects was economics. In the 80s, he followed the new organization of COMA on its promotion of debt-free money and employing the monetary fiscal of WW2 strategies, in particular to prevent inflation. The Great Recession motivated him to be more activist, like his university professor, Marshall McLuhan, who anticipated and warned us about the impact of social media on the growing violent quest for identity. I wonder what he would have thought about AI. Never mind. Joe decided to also be active in promoting monetary reform vision of Michael Kumhof's The Chicago Plan Revisited, so groups like AMY and Progressive Money Canada, and by communicating with good politicians and journalists. And Joe's topic is the monetary reform parallels between Canada and the United States, including a video presentation by a founder of COMA, Professor John Hotson. I remember him.
My topic is to focus on the Canadian monetary reform movement and show its connection to the American movement. They're quite intertwined. The key figures in the story is Professor John Hotson, who co-founded COMER, which stands for the Committee of Monetary and Economic Reform. So that institution and Professor Hotson are the two key elements in this story. Some titles of his papers make his thinking quite clear. In 1985, the year before co-founded COMER, he wrote Ending the Debt Money System. Around that time, he also wrote, What Did Lincoln and Roosevelt Know That Reagan Needs to Know? And Rooseveltonomics. I never heard of that one before. Reaganomics and Lincolnomics. Or How Come the Bankers Are Charging President Ron, 10% when FDR got his money at 2% and Honest Abe got his for nothing. And the Keynesian Revolution and the aborted Fisher-Simmons Revolution or the Road Not Taken. It's quite clear from those titles that we know what was on his mind. I've been unable to obtain copies yet, but the American Monetary Institute has archives, a 1986 radio show by Professor Blaine on the paper, and on an unknown Hotson at that time, and that is a good place to start. Professor Blaine, that is.
How did John Hotson? But I was able to federal government.
We can't hear it well. If it's on your...
With United States Treasury notes, money created by the government. A lot of people, not just the peculiarity of those that we do this. Well, he said what we should do now, we're 50 years late, by the way, but what we should do now is have the federal government pay the federal debt with United States Treasury notes, money created by the government. A lot of people are afraid of the government creating money, and unfortunately, it's a total misrepresentation of what goes on. At the present time, money is created by loans. It's not, very, very little of it is created by government, just the coins. And that's really the reason why we have our troubles. We don't have enough money. It's not too much money, it's a money shortage. So what Hotson proposes is that the United States Treasury pay the debt with money that it prints, just take and buy those debt certificates from the holders and give them this cash. At the same time, raise the reserve requirements of the banks so that this money that is being paid it does not go out into the economy, but rather just serves as reserves until the people who hold these demand deposits decide to write checks and decide to spend it. This proposal, by the way, has the support, this kind of idea of government money has the support of many people, one of whom is not a surprise. If you heard the program last month, you heard Abraham Lincoln Austin speaking about the Lincoln method of money creation, which he is supporting. You know, as you heard from him, his name is Abraham Lincoln. His father voted for Abraham Lincoln. It's pretty hard to believe. And of course, named his son after that great man.
So, this is a 40-year-old radio program by Professor Blaine, and he's stumbled onto Dr. Hotson at this conference, and we are hearing exactly what we're familiar with now. In 1991, he was well known enough to be flown to New Zealand for 1 month, and he stayed with a social credit group, and he was their keynote speaker at the conference. EMI has this video of that speech, and we are debuting it today. The speech provided the short epiphany millions of people needed to answer their question, how they could achieve a better world. He explained that recipe was the basis for movements in the past, which resulted in great advances. That recipe is having some simple, excellent knowledge that a movement can grow from.
Furthermore, every one of these greats is an ally to the cause of monetary reform, at least on certain pages of what they wrote. You have to be selected. Okay, so Adam Smith. Adam Smith made many exceptions to his general rule of let the market decide. Among the most important for our purposes are his support for usury laws to keep down the rate of interest, and his contempt for the special interest pleading of businessmen and bankers to the effect that what's good for us is good for the country. Now, Marx, quite rightly, probably has few, if any, admirers in the room, but he was very far from wholly wrong. Could anything be a better stated indictment of the quaint and curious custom of a government borrowing money from banks instead of creating the money itself than this statement of Marx's, which I'll now quote. This is from Das Kapital. Is there anything more crazy than that between 1797 and 1817, for example, the Bank of England, which was a private bank until 1947, maybe they reprivatized again, so that was me, not Marx, whose notes only had credit thanks to the state, then got, that is by the public, in the form of interest on government loans, for the power the state gave to it to transform these very notes from paper into money and then lend it to the state.
This is a theme that he mentions many, many times, and it's a question that's been asked by many monetary reformers. Why would a government with power to create money borrow it at interest to the point of national bankruptcy? In a very positive review of Professor Phillips' book, The Chicago Plan, he concluded that he would have liked the book to emphasize the plan solved that problem. Otherwise, it was a glowing review.
Now, if it wasn't Marx that said that, we'd probably print that up somewhere. But he's in bad order. Okay. Now, this would be far too long a lecture if I tried to show you all the many ways in which John Maynard Keynes is an ally to us in monetary reform. But I'll mention just a few things. He wanted to get interest rates down to zero and make it impossible for people to just sit on their assets and collect income. He talked of it as the euthanasia or mercy killing of the rentier, that you had to go out and enterprise with your money, use it in ways of risk it, the hope of a profit, to gain large incomes at all. He certainly is our ally in looking to full employment, using the government's fiscal and monetary and other policies to get the economy to full employment when it doesn't get there by itself. Marx failed to convince the world that capitalism doesn't run at full employment. Keynes, at least for 30 years there, convinced the world that we could run the economy at full employment if we'd only modify the system to get us there. And that's what we want too. Now, he also fought a good fight, and it shortened his life, to create the Bretton Woods twins of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in much better shape than what we actually got. Keynes fought hard for an International Monetary Fund which could discipline surplus countries and force them to expand. Instead, we got an International Monetary Fund which is only capable of hammering on the heads of those countries who had deficits in their balance of payments, who were in debt to the rest of the world. He pointed out this would be a disaster, and he was absolutely right. Okay, but which of these famous four?
So before we go into the fourth, another recurring theme of his was this notion of Keynes and the zero interest rates. And the period of the 1939 to 1970, where the rates were extremely low and allowed for very rapid growth. And look at these two graphs. There's the post-war Fed funds rate, and the changes they made in 1947, they moved it up to 1.75, and in 1948 they moved it up to 2. But take a look at the actual inflation rates at that time. The end of the war with controls and everything, the inflation rate was 2.3. It's on the far right-hand side. In 46, 47, and 48, it shows 8.3, 14.4, and 8.1. Can you imagine what the interest rates would be today if we were having this inflation? As a number of our guests, speakers have said, including our own Sam Hummel, inflation is used as an excuse to control us and to prevent government from doing the job it's supposed to do by forcing these increases in rates and making things so hard on so many. During that period, 1939 to 1970, a couple of economists, scholars, Doris Goodwin is a noted historian, and Robert Hockett, of course, is a law professor with great economic background. We had him as a guest last year. They've both written on that period. Doris Goodwin's paper was called "The Way We Won America's Economic Breakthrough During World War II." Hockett wrote a similar column for Forbes. Individual professor that we have talked about in the past, Josh Ryan Collins, has written a paper on Canada specifically, and they're all pretty much the same, showing how measures were taken during the war to really accelerate productivity, production, capacity, primarily low interest rates, much more purchasing of bonds by the central bank. And of course, the United States made an exception at that time because otherwise it's not allowed to, which again is a financialization process. These links, I will send these notes to the my speakers page at some point, and these will all be available to interested viewers. At any rate, he then starts talking about
is the one who is our closest ally if we really got to know him. Now, I want to spend a few minutes telling you something that may surprise you, that the economist that probably has the least good image in this room is also the one who, properly used, selectively used, is the best ally, and that's Milton Friedman. The very man, yes, I know, the very man who is known as the father of monetarism, of new rightism, of hammering economies down to zero inflation by almost zero output employment, was a disciple, was a student of the old Chicago school of the 1930s, who saw clearly, as clearly as anybody saw, that it was the banking system that had collapsed, and it was the banking system that had to be fixed. And what they advocated was what they called 100% money, that the government take back from the private sector all money power, money creation power, and then use it through its treasury or central bank or a new currency commission to expand the money supply constantly at the full employment potential of the economy. This was the program.
A few minutes later, he says about Friedman, he has quite a bit to say about Friedman.
This is in an article, The Case for Overhauling the Federal Reserve in Challenge for July-August 1985. Now, Friedman maintains that the trouble with government regulatory agencies is that they become captives of the very industry they were set up to control, and that the end result is often worse than if the government had let the industry alone in the first place. This is because the regulated industry, through the corrupted control agency, can use public power against the public interest. He maintains that this generalization applies in spades to the world's central bankers, who now serve the private bankers, not the public interest. However, the economist who has put this principle most colorfully is not Friedman, but Jan Kregel. Jan asks us to...
So, in the first few clips I've shown you, look at how much he has in common with us. Howard was talking about usury. He mentions usury. Talking about the central banks. We've heard considerable criticism of the central banks the last couple of days. I think Professor Hotson would love to have engaged with many of our guests, the academics that we've had the last few days. Professor Assis, Robbins, Professor Nakuno, and Mahar, and Macmillan, and others. He's at that. He was in that spot in 1985 and beyond, and he was quite ahead of his time. At this point,
but the question remains, how do you and I, who share these insights, this vision, and this passion for these ideas, make them real in a real world? How do we overcome the forces in the world, ignorance, greed, fear of the new, invested interest in the old, which keep the present system going? Now, Victor Hugo once said that all the forces in the world are not as powerful as an idea whose time has come. So then the question becomes, how do you make an idea's time come? Extremely important question. And the next question, is it even possible to make an idea's time come, or does it just happen? So that's what I want to spend the rest of my time with you on.
At this point, he's talking to social credit group. They know they have a position very similar to ours. They all know, they understand the problem. They all have a pretty viable solution, not as good as ours, but good. And he's saying the real problem is, how do you create a movement? And that he spends considerable time talking to them about that. It's something he's considered in his 5 or 6 years of growing popularity and influence.
I believe that if, and Margaret Mead wrote, never doubt that a small dedicated group can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. I believe that if we study movements whose ideas time came, whose ideas changed the world, we can see what has to be done to achieve meaningful monetary reform. Now, an idea's time comes when it shifts, when it is transformed from a position or content to a context which holds all positions. I'll read that again. An idea's time comes when it shifts, when it is transformed from a position or content to a context which holds all positions. And what does that mean? Perhaps a few examples will help. The idea is we ought to end slavery, or it would be great to explore the moon, existed for a very long time as positions before they became transformed into ideas whose time had come. As long as they were positions, they generated research and controversy and new positions, but they didn't happen. Somebody says we ought to end slavery. Somebody else will say, no, slavery is God's will. You say, no, it's not God's will. God shows me in personal revelations that he wants slavery to end. Well, it's not economically feasible, et cetera, et cetera. All this discussion, all this business of trying to appeal to facts and reason, the very thing that professors, among others, do, is a necessary but not sufficient condition for an idea's time coming. These are just positions and counterpositions and so on. But when an idea is transformed by a sufficient individual and political, passionate will to achieve it, then its time comes. When the idea, end slavery, is transformed from just a good idea that sets up other ideas to enough people, a critical mass of people saying, we must end slavery, and the only question becomes how, by what means to do that, then its time has come. John F. Kennedy made a trip to the moon, and idea's time has come by a speech where he committed the United States to do that. We're going to put a man on the moon and bring him back.
So he would have loved our conference, I'm sure. Even today, we heard 2 great ideas by Professor Robbins as to how to create momentum. Um, this is an individual who, in my view, is the total package as a monetary reformer. At 35 minutes, he shows that he's not just about the West. He is an internationalist. We've heard that today as well.
As shown in the last few issues of the State of the World's Children Report, that 500,000 children die every 12 months in the third world because we have not resolved the debt crisis, which is crippling their economies. It shows that large areas of Latin America and Africa are more poverty-stricken now than they were in 1970. It shows that it's because of the first world taking out more in debt repayments than it is putting in new resources. Now, throughout the 1980s, they've been stuck in a second Great Depression. But in 1990, another great ideas time came. It happened at the World Summit for Children almost 11 months ago, almost exactly 11 months ago.
So here he goes into world hunger, and then he talks about environmentalism. He covers all of the bases in this speech. Short speech, focusing on some fundamentals that we all need to know, and how to momentum to make it happen. To get a deeper dive on the Comer and the institution, or Hotson and the institution he created, his websites are available, or at least, his newsletters. There are two that I think particularly reveal his a little more in-depth thinking about what he has in mind. First one is a vision of economic sovereignty, and second is something called understanding money. And between the two of them, we see more of how much he has in common with the American movement. In this one video, the message is something he conveyed and Comer conveyed.
Independence and Constitution were signed. In the mid-1700s, pre-revolutionary America was still relatively poor. There was a severe shortage of precious metal coins to trade for goods. Franklin was a big supporter of the colonies printing their own paper money. In 1757, Franklin was sent to London. He ended up staying for the next 18 years here, nearly until the start of the American Revolution. During this period, the American colonies began to issue their own money. Called colonial scrip, the endeavor was very successful. It provided a reliable medium of exchange, and it also helped to provide a feeling of unity between the colonies. Remember, colonial scrip was just paper money, debt-free money, printed in the public interest, and not backed by gold or silver coin. In other words, it was a totally fiat currency. One day, officials of the Bank of England asked Franklin how he would account for the newfound prosperity of the colonies. Without hesitation, he replied,
"That is simple. In the colonies, we issue our own money. It is called colonial scrip. We issue it in proper proportion to the demands of trade and industry to make the products pass easily from the producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating for ourselves our own paper money, we control its purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay to no one."
This was just common sense to Franklin, but you can imagine the impact it had on the Bank of England. America had learned the secret of money, and that genie had to be returned to its bottle as soon as possible. As a result, Parliament hurriedly passed the Currency Act of 1764. This prohibited colonial officials from issuing their own money and ordered them to pay all future tax coins. In other words, it forced the colonies on a gold or silver standard. For those who still believe that a gold standard is the answer for America's current monetary problems, look what happened to America after that. Writing in his autobiography, Franklin said,
In 1 year, the conditions were so reversed that the era of prosperity ended and a depression set in to such an extent that the streets of the colonies were filled with unemployed.
Franklin claims that this was even the basic cause for the American Revolution.
As Franklin put it in his autobiography,
the colonies would gladly have borne a little tax on tea and other matters had it not been that England took away from the colonies their money, which created unemployment and dissatisfaction. The inability of the colonists to get the power to issue their own money permanently out of the hands of George III and the international bankers was the prime reason for the Revolutionary War.
by the time the first shots were fired in Lexington, Massachusetts on April 19, 1775, the colonies had been drained of gold and silver coin by British taxation. As a result, the Continental government had no choice but to print money to finance the war.
The same currency had worked so well 20 years earlier during times of peace that the Bank of England had Parliament outlaw it.
History repeats itself. We have Professor last year signing talked about the Congress having a bill to pay for the veterans' pension, and FDR vetoed it, and the Congress voted his veto. It went to the Senate and it lost, completing the process by one vote. But the reality is that here in America, we did to ourselves what Britain did to America. It benefited from using perfectly viable money, debt-free money. Mark Twain talked about the fact that Americans got away from the monarchy and a lack of freedom, came to America. Things were much freer. But eventually, they built a kind of their own little monarchy. People took the titles of colonel or general, and there was a hierarchy built and a subclass through slavery. So, you know, even when we make changes, we always have to be careful that they aren't undone. Christine Desson goes on to explain more about money. This is an excellent short little video. I'm just going to do the last part, which pertains precisely to us. I recommend the entire video. And again, I'll put those links in an attachment at some point.
No one seems to know this, but Amazon actually has a $50 million fund that they have to pay out.
I want to give one example that will be familiar to many of you. In the Civil War, the United States engaged in a gigantic project of money creation. Why it engaged in money creation? Because it entered the Civil War, the North entered the Civil War with an empty treasury. It tried to borrow in coin, the conventional way, as the war began. That was a dismal failure. No one would lend, certainly not silver coin, in those precarious circumstances. So how did it do it? It invented a money. It designed a money. You'll remember this money. Many of you have studied this. This is the greenback. That is, it borrowed in goods because it couldn't borrow in money. So it basically spent this money into circulation for different items, right? The point is that the government made the money from the center. How accessible was this money? The money went out selectively. It was paid to soldiers, suppliers, war industries. And how about the exchange they made? The government made this market. So this was a controversial kind of money, but the government, the courts declared it legal tender, as Congress had, that is confirming Congress's provisions. Here's Justice Bradley on the market made by money. And I'm going to read two quotes, one about the importance of the market made by this money for the government, and one about the importance for individuals. So here's what he had to say about the importance of the market and therefore of money for the government. If the government couldn't make and enforce IOUs, it would have had to impress all the labor, I'm not yet quoting, impress the labor it needed, seize the materials it needed, coordinate the production it required, all without money. That would have been very difficult, he says. Rather, the government must make a market by spending in small IOUs. Here's Bradley. It must stimulate and set in motion the industry of the country. In other words, it must purchase rather than impress. As for people, a market is also central. So here's Bradley again. Money is the great instrument of exchange by which the people transact all their own affairs with each other, that thing which they must have and which lies at the foundation of all industrial effort and all business in the community. That is, money allowed the people to deal with each other through a market. So here's the kind of market that Bradley had in mind, right? A market for a wartime America. To sum up, when we isolate a moment of money creation, we can see that money is not chosen by acclaim. In fact, the Greenback moment's a great episode in which many people vehemently opposed this kind of money. It was made out of paper. It did not bubble up evenly all across the nation. The government spent it into circulation selectively, prioritizing wartime industries. It did not naturally create a market. Instead, the government created that market for the US and for wartime America. In fact, Greenback stayed in circulation for decades after the war, lubricating an expanding economy. I could go on, but you get the point. Money is and was and is engineered. It was and is designed. The episode of money creation that occurred in Civil War America was controversial, idiosyncratic, but it's also representative of a moment of money creation and the process of money creation. So what are the implications? If money is by nature democratic, then we have no concerns but to let the market operate. To be sure, we have to clean up the market. So we have to correct for imperfections. We have to correct for incomplete information. We have to correct for transaction costs. And that is where the bulk of economics has put its attention. That's because, according to the old view, the logic of the market, like the logic of money, is democratic. But if money is sovereign debt, as it clearly is in the modern world, then we have more thinking to do. Neither money nor the market is by nature democratic, is by definition democratic. Rather, we have to make them so. So I want to return to the Civil War example a last time to see the power and urgency of that task of money design. First, the power of the task, the power of money design. We make money to govern ourselves. The stakes for the public in the case of the Civil War were existential. So the emancipation of 4.5 million people, descendants of earlier enslaved people, and the unity of the survival of the Union itself.
The theme that she has is money as a democratic medium. This is a series of conferences she's done. And she's talking here about designing money so that it is consistent with our pursuit of democracy. And what we've heard this weekend from a number of our presenters is that money isn't democratic. It's quite the reverse. Bruce was talking about that. Professor Robbins talked about that. And yesterday we heard several presenters talking about that. And it is a major problem. How are we going to design money? She's a law professor. How do we organize ourselves? Through the Constitution, our laws, our constitutional institutions, of which money is an extremely important element. It has been privatized. It has been hijacked. It is a public utility. And she's making that point. All these positions are things that Professor Hotson was saying. He used, and Calmer used Ben Franklin. They used Abraham Lincoln. Another theme in Comer and of Hotson was the rentier. In a newsletter by an economics professor, Keith Wild, he does an entire essay on rent seeking. The essay was titled "The Toll Gate Economy," which is very similar to a title I think that Professor Hotson has used, and he references Professor Hotson. And this is this is many years ago they wrote this, and he also references Henry George, and so and I'm trying to remember, somebody said it yesterday, I think, that both money and land are sources. I guess it was Professor Hutton, sources of the rentier, of wealth extraction. And in today's presentation by Professor Robbins, we saw that wonderful chart. I'd love to get a hold of that sometime and share it widely, showing that wages was the lowest share of improvement. Everything else was improving at a much faster rate. And that is the rentier in action. It's skimming real production. Henry George actually said that the worker shouldn't pay any taxes. Only the rentiers should. In his day, it might have been that that's all the tax you had to collect, but I don't know if that's possible today. In another newsletter, Ellen Brown is featured. Actually, she was in a number of the newsletters. And of course, she was writing about public banking. It's another tool, another way of having a more democratic organization and the use of money. She has presented to us as well. They had several newsletters on Gerald McGeer. He was a member of Parliament in the first part of the 20th century. And he too asked the question, why would a government with power to create money borrow it at interest to the point of national bank? Who did he ask that question of? The governor of the Bank of Canada. At that time, Bank of Canada had been nationalized, and there was 1939 quite a conference or committee, and things had been dire through the Depression. A war was approaching, and they were asking a lot of questions, and he was leading the charge. McGeer knew that the Fed chair Eccles supported a Keynesian approach. He knew Edison, who lived through the Greenback era, supported debt-free sovereign money. He knew that in 1931, the Macmillan Report explained money creation by the banks. It said, it is not unnatural, it's a rhetorical flourish, double negative, it is not unnatural to think of the deposits of a bank as being created by the public through the deposit of cash, representing either savings or amounts which are not for the time being required to meet expenditure. That's the typical intermediary approach. But the bulk of the deposits arise out of the action of the banks themselves, or by granting loans, allowing money to be drawn on an overdraft of purchasing securities. A bank creates credit in its book. Is the equivalent of a deposit. We're very familiar with that. What we're not familiar with, I don't think, is how long people have known this. Keynes, of course, has been a proponent of that. Keynes was on this committee. McGeer knew that Irving Fisher, advocated in a 1930 radio address, short time before this committee started, that the money supply should be 100% government-issued cash. And in 1939, with the war on the horizon, common sense would suggest that after 10 years of oppression, we could not afford to defend ourselves. That would be living beyond our means. That would be the situation where the credit card was full. But McGeer knew enough to ask the governor of the Bank of Canada about the possibility of mobilizing our available and often idle, but unaffordable resources to make this extension. And he asked the question, would you admit that anything physically possible and desirable can be made financially possible? And the answer was yes. Links it again further. Another, just to continue the Canadian theme, spent the time on Hotson primarily, but another important Canadian advocating monetary reform is William White. And you can see below in this little picture his credentials. He was with the Bank of England, the Bank of Canada, the Bank of International Settlements. This man knows the banking system, central banking system, the monetary system inside out. Like Ordonez, he's a central banker who supports monetary reform. In why the monetary policy framework in advanced countries needs a fundamental reform, August 3rd, 2023, he makes some very surprising statements. Against the backdrop, the suggestions made in the 1930s by the Chicago School for Professor Phillips' paper in the anniversary book edition to introduce a narrow money regime carefully reassessed. By eliminating the capacity of private agents to create assets and substitute for money created by the public sector, there would be a greater potential for controlling the upward drift in prices and for reducing harmful boom-bust cycles that have become increasingly common in recent years. Well, much, perhaps all, of financial regulation and public safety nets might be made redundant in such a framework. Finally, by restricting the creation of money to public sector entities, the demand for that money would increase sharply. Commensurately, the cost of debt service for non-money public sector debt would be significantly reduced. All of these would be positive development. Evidently, a regime change of this magnitude would need careful assessment and even more careful implementation. However, the recent suggestion that central banks might introduce central bank digital currencies raises the possibility of extending that initiative to introduce a narrow money framework. That possibility should not be ruled out of the hand, given the difficult circumstances bequeathed to us by the previous monetary regime. That is an extraordinary statement by a highly respected and accomplished central bank, just as Ordonez has been making. And I think it's worth noting that his prescription is related to something that we did in a reading circle by the former Dutch bank chief economist Thomas Mayer, someone who also knows the system inside out. His paper, How to Escape from the Debt Trap, Lessons from the Past. He explores the use of consols with a zero coupon and infinite maturity, and bonds would cease to count as government debt. That's a wonderful option. He sees the Chicago Plan combined with introduction of central bank digital currencies as an option for the future. And he also reminds us of the success of World War II using the term financial repression, something I haven't really been familiar with, but I found it lately. That is, real interest rates were so low during and after the war that robust growth reduced post-war debt to GDP ratios dramatically. So my conclusion, Professor John Hotson died at 6 in 1996, while the momentum of his influence was still rising. He espoused the same measures that we do. He used the same American historical precedents that we do, such as Franklin and Lincoln. He selected two strategies that we can learn from. Emphasize an initial monetary reform message from a few compelling principles that have historical precedent. Simple vision regular voters can adopt and demand from their politicians. Simple vision in which critical mass for change emerge. He also advocated for monetary and economic measures under the current monetary system, which recreate the economic miracles in the years 1939 to 1970, as described by Goodwin and Hockett. In particular, the central bank would buy government bonds directly, and interest rates would be kept extremely low to permit government investment. That is infrastructure, housing, energy, transportation, health, education, environmental, and sustainability. And the government would recreate an infrastructure bank. In World War II, it was called the Reconstruction Finance. Worth noting that if you look at what China has done for the last 15 years or more, that's what they've done. They have simply employed the World War II strategy. John Hotson wanted to use every arrow in his quiver to improve the economy for I have a few little charts. I probably started using up too much time, but just this is a part of federal debt held by the public, and you can see in World War I, it shot up and then fell off dramatically. World War II, it fell off. It shot up and fell off dramatically. The reason being that the global interest rates were actually below zero during that, in those two valleys that you can, the 1940s. And yet the consumer prices in the First World War were averaging 15 to 20%. And interest rates during that period, and actually this chart shows right up to 1960. Bond rates ranged from 3.5 to 5%. During that 15% inflation, mortgage rates were a little bit higher. That's extraordinary. Some of you may remember the 1980 18% mortgage. So that's my review of Canada's role in advancing the monetary reform message. And I hope we can all spread our video of John Hotson. It's really worthwhile. And I think we'll be adding the radio program by Professor Blaine as well.
We created, it's on a Dropbox, and if you put it in your papers, Joe, it'll be shared with anybody who wants to hear it.
Okay.
We have 18 more minutes, Joe. Should we take questions, or do you have more thoughts to share at this point, or what is best?
No, I just think that it's nice to, near the finish, end with someone who shared so many thoughts in advance of so many wonderful presentations. Professor John Hotson.
Yeah. I'm just curious about Canadian monetary history a bit. Can you share with us a little bit of what may have happened in the 70s that Canada lost monetary control a little bit to the international system?
Well, I think a number of our speakers, including Sam Hummel, explained that the plutocratic financial system has capitalized on the inflation that started at that time and said, oh, we've got to stop Keynesianism. This is Keynes's fault, right? And of course, that was an excuse. That was a hidden agenda proposal. Seeing the two periods I showed where inflation was high, but interest rates were low during the First and Second World War, shows that was totally unnecessary because inflation fell without pushing up interest rates.
Mm-hmm.
Nick, you have your hand up.
Let me unmute. A great presentation, Joe. I really appreciated the Canadian historic aspect and the actual video and auditory, from these guys 40 years ago is really, really something. And I want you to tell everybody about, remember, I don't know, it was maybe a week ago or so that in our different communications back and forth, you mentioned, and I'm going to tell a little background on this Comer that you referred to. I've heard you say that before, and I thought Comer was a person, an economist. And you referred to Comer did this, Comer did that, or whatever it was a few times. And just showing you my own ignorance. And then Joe shared with us a letter that he got from Professor Hotson. And what year was that? Was that 88 or 78?
No, it was 1988.
1988.
Yep.
He got a letter from Professor Hotson because Joe had written a letter to maybe, I don't know,
The Toronto Star.
You had written a letter to the newspaper somewhere, right?
Right.
And he was responding to that. And so we're going back to 1988, 36 years ago. You were involved in this monetary reform movement with Professor Hotson. And I just found that really, really impressive.
You actually raised a moment of great regret. I was a young guy with 3 young kids, doing a full-time job plus a little part-time work to get a little extra money for the family. And I did go to a meeting or two. I actually took some economic students. but I didn't, get involved regularly. And it's just one of the few regrets I have in life.
Well, I have plenty of those regrets that I didn't get involved in things earlier, but now we can make up for that. So
yes, we are making up for it right now. Professor Phillips, the hand up.
Yes, I think. Can you see me now? Whoops. Yeah, Joe, thanks a lot for talking about John Hotson. I, of course, knew John very well. I got to know him before I wrote my book. So we had correspondence. I've got lots of emails and stuff from John. He was able to read the draft manuscript of my book that I had, and then he ended up maybe one of the last things he did. He reviewed my book. I think it was the Eastern Economics Journal. But John was a great guy. It was really a loss of him, when he died. And I think I sent you that photo that we had a great session with Mohsen Khan from the IMF, and John and I, and I forgot the other guy from Canada. You probably remember. And that was maybe 92 or sometime. I can't remember.
William
exactly.
Krehm?
Yeah, no. I knew Krehm, but Irvin Doak, that was his name. And he was at, I think in Halifax. So I can't remember exactly where he was. But John was, I just wanted to say, great to bring up John's name, and he was a great guy. So thanks.
Well, thank you. That's great. It's 6 degrees of separation. We're so lucky to have someone who engaged with them and had that connection. I really liked this review of your book. And as I say, he's a very passionate guy. So he kind of gave you one little needle at the end there. Why didn't you go further?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, no, we talked about that. And we talked about it. And John, yeah, I appreciated his review of my book very much. Yeah. He had good points.
He was quixotic. He was charging away. Do you have any of his paper? I
have emails from him, and things. I don't know if any of that's.
Yeah, those are
stuff.
Really pointed titles.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
He was passionate about that.
Oh yeah, I know he was. He was a great guy. Really was.
Thanks so much for that, Ronnie.
Okay.
John Conroy.
Kind of a luxury to be able to look into this. Really, you and Nick mentioned that maybe you wish you had looked into it at a younger age, and we all have things we have to do, and most of America and maybe Canada is busy trying to make things work in their life, and they don't have time to do this. I found monetary reform when I had some time on my hands and dug into it. So that's just an observation. And the other one would be that some people actually don't enjoy intellectual pursuits. So, that's kind of the landscape we're operating in as we try to, bring this idea to the masses.
And I can remember saying this to students in the early 80s, because the things were, going out of crazy at that time with the interest rates. And I'm teaching money as part of the course, and talking about fractional reserves, and saying to the kids, you could print 100% of the money. It doesn't have to be a fraction, but we would all stay in the vaults. You just have a bigger target. And so it was very interesting to find that the piece where Fisher said the same thing. And I believe Ronnie, in some of the correspondence that he built his book on, and maybe he can clear this up, but I think Simons talked to Fisher about that and said it wasn't necessary. Do you know what I'm referring to, Ronnie?
Yeah, there's I'd have to look, and I think I sent you. I think you have all that correspondence. Mm-hmm. But there is Simons talking about Fisher, and frankly, Simons thought Fisher was a little over enthusiastic. In fact, everybody thought Fisher was a little over enthusiastic and about how this is going to solve all the problems. And I think he just basically annoyed everyone. Lachlan Curry told me that Fisher would come and ask to see Franklin Roosevelt Roosevelt would send him to Morgenthau, and Morgenthau would send him to Lockley Curry. So Curry was one who ended up having to deal with Fisher quite a bit.
Now, I think Curry was a Canadian economist. Is that right?
That is correct. But
and I mention that because John Hotson was an American, but he settled in a university. But he was very aware of all that information that we know of about the colony money and Abraham Lincoln and so forth. And it was a wonderful way to sell that project. And William Krehm, of course, was a brilliant individual, and they made a wonderful team and built a very good movement. As you may know, they tried to sue the Bank of Canada, doing unconstitutional things. I thought they fought the wrong fight. They were more about the Bank of International Settlements and its influence. And Steve referred to that, that period when the Bank of International Settlements had a big influence on the switch from a Keynesian approach to a monetarist approach, and how debt increased rapidly all over the world because of that, because it was adopted everywhere. You're muted, Steve.
Ronnie, while we have you there, could I ask, do you have any thoughts about Henry Simon's thinking on monetary reform or a Chicago plan versus Fisher? It seems like Simon's about 7-8 years earlier had some different ideas.
Well, I mean, the way, Fisher wrote a book, he had that, and it had that article in Econometrics about debt deflation and all of that. And he had Fisher had his stamp money and all this stuff. But basically, the way I believe, if you look at it historically, Fisher learned about the Chicago plan, and then he just adopted that. He became sort of the main advocate for this 100% reserve plan. And the more enthusiastic he became, the less enthusiastic Henry Simons became. And that's clear in correspondence. And
it seems like Simons was trying to keep the monetary system a little bit more pure, where the banks would have a little harder time creating money than what Fisher was doing.
Yeah, I mean, Fisher, I think, was trying to get into the politics because, he was wanting to see Roosevelt, and all of this. He wrote and he had papers, magazines and stuff like that. So, and Simons very clearly, his starting point was saying, that the perfect system is one in which you have money and consoles, or infinite maturity debt. Simons wanted to abolish all short-term debt. So you would have money issued by the government and infinite debt. Any debt that was issued had to be basically, 100-year debt or whatever, unlimited duration,
Right.
So that he had that was his vision of the perfect society, financial system.
Well,
I think the UK has some perpetual bonds, doesn't it?
What?
Doesn't the UK have a history of using perpetual bonds?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know. I think that's true. I don't know that much more about it, but I think that is true.
A long time ago.
Yeah.
John, your hand's still up. Did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, it's a different subject. I just in viewing all of these presentations and all of our efforts to move monetary reform along, I had the thought that, when you get to a crowd that's like not familiar or maybe even hostile to this idea, they might ask, like, what would our detractors say about the idea in a general way? What do your detractors say about this idea? So we might be wise to kind of be ready for those questions if we ever get a platform, to present them where it's a new idea to a large group of people, and also have replies. They say whatever, that greenbacks had to be abandoned at some point, and here's the reason. And then the follow-up also would be, and here's why we disagree. So I think at some point, if we get some success, we're going to hear those arguments.
We better be ready.
Thank you, John. It looks like we're good right now. Let's see if we can start a few minutes before 4 o'clock. Do you have any more thoughts or questions, Elizabeth, for Joe?
Yes, I do. How would it be physically done? Would it still have to go through the banks, or could the government just send out, let's say, old age securities? Bank of Canada sends it. I mean, it shows up in my bank account now. Where does it come from? Does the Bank of Canada borrows this money? Or could they not just print it? Or basically, let's say, as coins, send it out. How would it physically be done?
Well, in terms of John Hotson, that was his preference, that you would have sovereign money issued by the central bank, which is unambiguously nationalized in Canada. Yeah. And the central bank would provide that money to the government when they have a shortfall, and they could send that money directly, right? So they hopefully taxes close to providing the needed funds, but it's the shortfall. I think Friedman talked a lot about that. That it was about the shortfall. He would have the central bank provide the funds to meet the shortfall, and until it was a full employment economy. And if there was inflation, he would have the central bank not provide but Hotson also said we could do the same thing with the current system, more or less. And this is really the MMT thinking. And it's not, MMT is really just Keynes. And they have these quirky ideas about tax and spend and so forth. But basically, Hotson supported that as well, where the Bank of Canada or the Federal Reserve should be able to buy the bonds directly. The interest is returned to the government. So there is no real debt servicing. And it would make even more sense, as Ronnie said, to have perpetual bonds. But they can still be rolled over, and that is not real debt. So he, the proof was in the pudding. World War II worked wonderfully well. We saw how the debt in that chart dropped dramatically. And they did so much infrastructure, so much improvement. Housing building and so forth, and in the Ryan Collins paper, he referred to the Development Bank in Canada, and of course the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Again, Ronnie's told us about that. Was an incredible success, and I can't remember if it was Ronnie, but someone said it was kind of like the largest business entity in the country at its peak. It was doing so much. And basically it was a public bank. It was Congress, I think, had financed it. It was doing loans and financing an enormous expansion of capacity in the United States.
Elizabeth,
so there's a number of answers, I think, to your question.
Yeah.
So why are we not doing it?
Well, that's what Doris Goodman asked 20 or 30 years ago when she wrote that article. That's what Robert Hockett, from last year, asked. Why aren't we doing it? And I think they're absolutely right. And China is doing it. And China also, a little something extra they have going for them is that they are the main shareholders of their major banks. So they've got that kind of public banking going too.
Well, I have a long letter from Paul Martin saying why we couldn't do it, because it would affect our international rate, etc., etc. But there's really no reason why we can't do it, as long as we do it carefully and not too much.
Well, of course, has to be. You know, if you're going, as Keynes would have pointed out, if you run out of land, labor, and capital that is idle, then you have to. You've reached your limit. That's the true constraint. The constraint, as we have often said, is not money. It is our land, labor, and capital. The money is something we produce. It's a creature of the law, and Holden has often made that point.
Another question. You're okay, Elizabeth?
Well, I still don't know why we don't know to it, but there you are.
Well, we'll ask it one more time. Ask it one more time. You're still wondering why they don't. When banks create money, if they get it from their vault and it's other people's money and they know that, that's a moral money system. If someone comes in, if you go in for a loan and they create the money, they just have a computer print money into your account. That's not moral. So what Joe and I and everyone's working for is the moral system that they actually have the money in the back room to put there. And there's ways for them to be moral, and we can help them do that. That's our biggest goal. Joe's also pointing out, first and foremost, we have to take care of the government and make sure the government has enough money first. And then we can think about other forms of continuing monetary reform too. But
yes, that was Hotson's focus.
More so Krehm, right?
And William Krehm, yeah. That the number one, you know, they weren't sort of taking on the banks quite as much as AMI and AFJM. It was more about making sure that the government has the power, since it has the power to create money, should not be borrowed, and therefore not be obstructed from doing its job.
That would be the crucial point, and there shouldn't be government debt associated with it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the fight with the banks, you know, they're so big and they have such great lobbies. I think they're right in focusing on that particular aspect, and in reproducing the World War II approach. It was a little different approach than AFJM and AMI, but you know, he was sitting in the same pew, in the same church and in the same pew.
Yeah, and he too knew about Lincoln, and we were if we're going to be moral about it, we tend to feel like at this point, if we're going to go in for the fight, we might as well go all the way back to Lincoln and really create fiat money and let that dominate. And but Elizabeth, there you go. We'll keep at this. We're learning.
Well, I think you just answered it. The banks objecting to it, and I think they have a very strong lobby, and I think that's the reason. Am I right?
Yes, you're. The senator in my state, his name is Dirksen, and Dick Durbin, rather. He says the banks run Washington, and they don't even actually have to run it; they actually own it. He said so. The banks own Washington, and that's the problem. And but anyhow, we have 5 minutes before Gwendolyn starts. Go ahead, Joe.
Elizabeth, did you see Professor Robbins' presentation?
I can't remember.
It was earlier today.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's one. I mean, that's one of many that I'm going to watch again, because there's just so much to learn. It's so hard to absorb to mine all the gold in such presentations.
Yes. Okay. Well, let's go again.
One more quick question.
Oh, wait. We'll take your question. I just want to make a quick announcement. We're on a break now. We've got 5 minutes. So at the top of the hour, we'll ask Gwendolyn Hall-Smith to help lead us understand local currencies and complementary currencies and the history of that in the United States. But now go ahead with your question, Elizabeth.
Yeah, very quick, because we own the central bank, but in the States, it's private. Could they do it in the States? We can do it, but because the States, it's not, it's private. I think it would be a different problem, right?
Well, there's two answers to that. One is, I think that's basically a conspiracy theory. That the bank, I think Zarlinga said it was an ambiguity of the central bank of the United States, and I certainly agree with that, and I certainly would like to see it fully and properly nationalized. But it, 99% of the profits from the Fed go to the government, and that would be a pretty rotten private outfit. It gives away 99% of its profits. Having said that, both in Canada and United States, the bankers have way too much they have it on pure public central banks, and they have it on this hybrid version in the United States, and that's a big problem.
Joe, I don't know about your 99%. If that's accurate, it's after every bank that is a shareholder in the Federal Reserve gets its 6% annual dividend, and after all the expenses, however the Fed defines them, are calculated and paid out. If there are pennies left, that goes to the Fed, and 99% of those pennies go to the Fed. I mean, the government.
It's about, right. The New York Times in 2012 had some articles out about where the Fed puts out money. For example, it puts out hundreds of millions of dollars in grants or in contracts to educational firms to help research policy and ideas, but along with it is the assumption that they're very much believing in how the Fed and the banking system works, and they're not tolerating very well people with opposing or monetary reform ideas at the same time. So educationally, they help control the subject matter too. So, but yes, that's step one. We want to make it more properly nationalized in terms of the accounting, in terms of all matters. But by how they hire and how they pay and how they run the business, it's a private business. So, but anyhow, let's get started. We're going to begin in just 2 minutes now, and we got to get things ready now. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Joe. And thank you, everyone.